In previous video, I showed an example of how to deploy Presto in a container and connect it to Azure Data Lake Store and Azure WASB. And you can read about it and watch the video on my blog and on a GitHub. Today, I wanted to talk about another example. What if you wanted to connect Presto to multiple Azure Data Services, query data from them, aggregate it, and put it in Azure storage? Presto, out of the box, comes with many connectors. And these connectors allow you to connect to various sources. And in this example, I just wanted to experiment with a few of them. So let me show you which ones I had in mind. So for example, we will use a Hive connector to connect to Azure Storage. We will use MongoDB connector to connect to Azure Cosmos DB database. We use MySQL connector to connect to Azure MySQL service. Postgres for Azure Postgres, and SQL Server connector to connect to Azure Database. So we will basically have all of these connectors in play as we go and try it out. You can find all of the code for this inside of the same GitHub repo, Docker Presto DLS WASB. And again, this is an example of a single node Presto. And inside of the README file, Azure Data Services, I lay out an example of creating the various databases and then configuring Presto to query them. In this walkthrough, I just wanted to walk you through and explain a few of the interesting parts of that configuration. One of the first things I wanted to just quickly put on this PowerPoint slide an approach that I'm trying. I put, let's say I have a movies database with users, tickets, user movie ratings, and user movie rating ticket aggregated joint collection that I want to put in blob storage to then run some machine learning algorithms on. And for some reason, let's say my data is spread out across different data sources. Let's say I have my movies catalog in a Cosmos DB and using Mongo API. I have my users table in my Azure SQL. I have my tickets in MySQL and user movie ratings in Postgres. Why data is in these locations is not really important, but let's say there is some data each place, and I want to query the data, join it all together and create an aggregate join here. I can use Presto to achieve that. And this is just an example. Obviously, in the real world, you would have a completely different situation, but this will show how to do it and apply it in different cases as well. As a first step, what I will show you is just how to create the databases quickly, and we'll populate them with data so you can see them from the beginning. So I clicked here, created a Cosmos database. And when I created Cosmos database, I gave it a name. I selected an API, and in my case, I used MongoDB API, which has a connector in Presto. I gave it a region, a location, and deployed it. Once it was deployed, I basically have my global Cosmos database. In my case, I have it in East US region. And what I did there is, for now, nothing. I did not yet create a collection, and I did not yet populate the data. We'll do it together using the command line MongoDB client from my machine. I'll show you how to connect to that Presto instance. So what I have here is I downloaded MongoDB client for Windows, and I put the binary files, I extracted the binary, and I have them sitting right here. And I will right now initiate a connection to my MongoDB API of the Cosmos DB database using the Mongo shell. I'll change the password after the fact, so you'll see the password in the query line for now. Mongo executable, the name of my Mongo database, the port, all of this information is inside of the getting started, quick start over here. The username, the secret password. I must use SSL because the Cosmos DB is by default secure and requires SSL and authentication. So once I connect to it from my client, I will be able to see that I don't have any databases yet. And what we will do is we will create. So notice I do not have any databases, and we will basically follow the information that I have in the repo to copy a few insert statements and to show you how we're going to populate the movies catalog. So take a look. Basically, I just run a few insert statements into the movies collection. ID, movie name, year, length, etc., etc. But this is just a regular Mongo API. And then I can see my movies, again, using the Mongo API inside of my Cosmos DB. So that's my movies collection. Now let's move on to our Azure SQL and populate the table of users, right? Because that's where our users are going to be. So I have an Azure SQL database that's running in my subscription. And we will use a tool that's built into the portal for populating and creating the tiny table and populating it with data instead of using some client tool. So I will just use this query editor preview. I will log in into my database. Okay. And now I will create my table. So let's see if we have any tables yet. We do not have any tables yet. So for this purpose, we have a bunch of tables, but not the table that we care about. And now let me populate the table with information. So here is going to be create users table, extremely simple, user ID, and the name. We'll populate it with a few users and select back from the users. So now we have our SQL table, and this is the data, user and name. Very simple. Next, we'll move on to the MySQL data. So for MySQL, it's a preview service right now. I created already a server and a database in my subscription, and I'm pulling it up right now so you can use this find in the UI to quickly find your resources by searching by partial names, and that's what I did. I pulled it up. This is my database, and you can see that I'm enforcing SSL. This is MySQL 5.4. Let's connect to it. It looks like it has a database that I created, but it doesn't have the table yet. So how will I connect to it? So what I will do is, again, I have a client that I already download, just a regular MySQL shell. And to connect to MySQL, I will use a command line that points to my SQL endpoint right there. That's the SQL name, my database name, my user, and then I will say that I prefer the SSL mode, and I will provide a password by typing it in. So let's see what happens. So I'll enter my password, and right now I'm connected to the MySQL database, and it doesn't have any tables yet. So we will basically create ourselves a table. I'm just copying statements from the GitHub repo with example, just tiny table with nothing interesting in there, except user ID, movie ID, price, and purchase date for the tickets, right? And I'm just going to populate it with your few records and select it back. So we got now user IDs, movie IDs, price, and purchase date. And that's our SQL MySQL database. Now let's do Postgres. So for Postgres, again, I have a database, a preview service running in Azure. I find it right here, Postgres. And again, I use a command line tools, just regular pSQL tools to connect to Postgres. I have them downloaded. And then I point it to my database endpoint. I say require SSL mode and connect to my database. At this point, I'm connecting to the database. It will ask me to authenticate the regular, and now I'm there, and you can see that I do not have any tables yet. And at this point, what I will do is I will create very quickly a table for user movie ratings, and I'll insert some couple records there just as an example. And then we will select from those ratings. And there we go. So user ID, movie, and rating that they gave it. So now we have all of our data sources configured: movies, users, tickets, and movie ratings. Next, we'll go into what we need to do to create a table in Azure Storage to store the results. And then we'll use Presto to actually run the query that joins data from all of these sources and puts it in this fourth source. So quickly looking at the code, I will not go into too much detail because it is described in the previous video. I added a few more sections to this config file. This one that shows if you want to configure Mongo using on Cosmos, you would provide this information. username and password, true, and obviously it would be in your private file. And same thing for SQL Server, MySQL in Postgres. All of these environment variables will be passed on right here to the Presto and Hive when we start them using Docker Compose, which will start right now. So while we're looking at the code, we'll meanwhile kick off the Docker Compose that will bring up those two things. And let's go back and look at what happens with these environment variables. When the environment variables are passed, they are flowing through to the start Presto code and basically checks if the environment variable exists. So you want to keep it empty if you don't want to provide it. It creates the proper catalog properties or connections inside of the Presto, right? So this is for Azure SQL and basically populates those values right there. Okay, and then it launches Presto, and by the time Presto is running, in this case, all of these catalogs are configured, and they're based again on this environment variable being set. So if you set them in your config, don't forget to zero these out if you want not to configure it, because I put some examples here to make it easier for you to know what the structure of the strings looks like. So you can see below, these are the logs of the starting Presto. And once Presto starts, we will open up connectivity to it using the same example that we did last time. So at this point, our containers seem to have started, and we can double check it by looking at Docker PS and seeing the two containers are running. We will now take the query string, the bash command to execute on an open. So I'm copying the command from the GitHub repo, docker exec Hive bash, and I'm going to open up right now my session on my Hive server. And following the instructions from before, I'm just going to, from the repo, I'm going to start Hive pointed to the remote metastore, which is really running locally, but it is considered remote because I'm specifying in this URL. Once this starts, we will create a table. So now it started. And our next step is to create a table that will store the output of our query. So let's look at this. It creates a table, user movie ratings, and the main things that it creates it stored as text file in my container called test hive, and then my storage account in this folder. So this should take a second. And once it's created, we will see it. So you probably noticed that over here it failed, saying that the table already exists right here. Right? And what I did then is I went ahead because of my previous tests, I dropped the table and I created it again, and this time it succeeded. Okay, and at this point, we can double check that the table is actually there and it's empty. So what does it mean it's there? If we go to Storage Explorer and we refresh the container where I created this table, we should be able to see the empty file and no folder yet that's created in Azure Storage. This is basically my storage account, and there's no data there yet. Now we're going to go into Presto, start the Presto client, and run some query that will aggregate the data and put it there. To connect to my Presto client, I will just open a bash session on a running Presto container. There we go. And I will execute the command to connect to the Presto server using Presto CLI. So Presto CLI is right here pointing to the Presto running on this port, on this container. Once this is done, because we configured all of our catalogs, hopefully correctly, we should be able to see show catalogs. And those going to show us that we have the Cosmos DB, let's see, Azure SQL, MySQL, Postgres. And you can see the first attempt timed out. I'm running on a machine with a low memory and running a lot of things at the same time as recording this. But second time I run it, it came through with the catalogs we defined, right? So now that the catalogs are defined, let's actually look inside of the Mongo database, for example, using simple syntax in SQL. So I am right now trying to query Cosmos DB, and I'm saying, give me data from my DB1. And I think because our database is created in a different name, we're not able to see it. So where do we find our data? It looks like what I was creating, I forgot to create a database. So my collection movies got created under the test database. I went to the document, the Data Explorer for Cosmos, and I can see my movies right there, right? So let's now fix the query that I had to point it to the correct schema test. And you can see the data from that database. Let's now do query. So we're querying from Presto, Mongo or Cosmos DB, querying Azure SQL, and it's complaining that my IP address is not whitelisted. I will do it in a second. So my SQL IP address needs to be whitelisted for security. And let's query MySQL for now, and then we'll fix that one behind the scenes. So this is querying MySQL database, and we got our tickets data from there. And then now we're going to query PostgreSQL database. And that's the Postgres data. Now let me go back very quickly and fix the Azure SQL. I'll pause the video for a second. So here's where I went. I found my SQL, Azure SQL instance, set firewall, and I need to add client IP. Basically, my IP address changed recently, so that's why it's not there, and it's updating the firewall rules now. I will pause the video for. Okay, great. The firewalls rules were updated successfully with my IP address, and now when so you can say success, and now when I run my data selection from the Azure SQL right here, you can see the data came back. Let's try it again just in case. You can see our users. So at this point, we have all of our mini data sets, movies, users, tickets, and user ratings, and we're going to generate this as an output. So how are we going to do that? We're going to create this insert statement that's going to say insert into Hive default user movie rating ticket. This is the table that we backed by Azure Storage, which is currently empty. We're going to run a regular SQL statement, select user ID, etc., do some casting to make sure our types are proper. And we see we're selecting right here from our Azure SQL Database users table, inner joining to our MySQL tickets table, joining that to the Cosmos DB. I had to fix this from my database DB to test DB movies collection on the movie ID and joining it to the movie ratings. And then we're taking all of this information and we're going to insert it into the tickets. Before inserting, let's just run the query because this is a small data set and see how that looks directly in the Presto's CLI. We should be able to get back a result set if I type the query correctly. So right now it's issuing these requests from Presto node, in this case one node in a small container on my VM, to all of these catalogs that we configured when we deployed this Presto. And you can see it's running. And you can see it came back and pulled data actually from all of these places. It pulled in the user ID, the count, the price, the purchase date, and many other things right here, right? So it pulled all of that information for us. It gave these columns names because I didn't alias them. And now let's see if we can have all of that go directly into Azure SQL by an insert statement. So we're going to rerun this query right now. But instead of outputting to the screen, we're going to see if we can write it directly to storage. So what is happening? Let's look at our container and refresh. We see the data is not yet being created. Let's see if we received any errors yet. So far it's running. It started running, and Presto in the multi-node environment would be running this on all the nodes. It inserted 4 records, and you can see we now have a table, JZipped file created right here because we told it to be plain text with comma delimitation. and let tab, I think, delimited or comma delimited, and you can see the data is there. Now let's double check that the data is actually there by selecting from the Hive table that's backing storage. We should see 4 records there. Boom, and they're there. Now let's try to download this file and look inside of the file and see how that data looks. All right, so I downloaded the gzip file. I use 7-zip to open it up. I see inside of it there is a small, what seems to be a text file, and I double click on that and open it up in Notepad, and you can see this data, comma delimited, data from many sources all joined and landed in storage. Basically, that achieves this simple, proof of concept of querying from Presto to multiple Azure Data Services and outputting to WASB. And same thing could be output to Azure Data Lake Store following just using another connector, the one that I described in the previous video. So you can try this all for yourself by going to this repo, watching the previous video probably, and then deploying the just running Docker Compose and filling in the information in the environment config. And once you're done, use this Azure Data Services to create some sample data sets, and you can go from there. That is basically the example. Thank you for watching.